Okay, we are live.
Oh, hello. Hello, everyone. My name is Dominic Sachsenmaier, and I'm a professor of Chinese and global history at Göttingen University in Germany. And it's my great honor to open the second part of our online panel, Conceptualizing Planetary Humanities. And like this part, also the first part is available on YouTube. I'm very glad to host this panel together with Professor Bo Strath of the Academy of Finland and the University of Helsinki, and with Professor John Noyes of the University of Toronto. And this panel is also partly organized by a project, a trans-regional research network on world making that Göttingen University shares together with the University of Heidelberg, the Free University of Berlin, and the University of Würzburg, sponsored by the German Ministry of Education and Research. And before we start our discussion, I want to take the opportunity and thank Mrs. Zhao Xiaoyang very, very much for all her organizational work, and also Janice Hsiung. Janice is a postdoctoral fellow at Göttingen University, and Mrs. Zhao is a graduate assistant. So, and now to come to the topic of planetary humanities. I mean, we all know that, well, there are some problems with the configuration of knowledge and academia at large, and within humanities in particular. And we all know that, of course, that there are significant global dangers, problems, challenges. I mean, just to name a few, like the global environmental crisis or the growing trend of anti-internationalism and even bloc building, bloc formations in our current world. And I think, I mean, what we want to do in this panel is to reflect upon new ways beyond academic specialization and beyond this kind of regular academic competition and the very problematic hierarchies of knowledge and global sociologies and institutionalizations of knowledge that come with it, and reflect upon new ways of what the humanities can do, what type of thinking they could develop, and what kind of contents they could cover, what kind of questions they could ask. And we decided to invite like a group of diverse scholars, being from a variety of fields, but also based in different parts of the world, but also primarily working on different parts of the world, to join our conversation. Well, in today's panel, the second panel, we have, like yesterday, we have 5 distinguished scholars. And I'll be very happy to introduce our first speaker, who is Professor Selcuk Esenbel, and she's Professor of History at Boğaziçi University, the Department of History in Istanbul, and she's also the founding director and academic coordinator of the Asian Studies Center there. She's widely published in Japanese history and global history, and also in the history of the relations between Japan and the world of Islam. And Professor Esenbel is the recipient of various awards like the Order of the Rising Sun, the Japan Foundation Special Prize for Japanese Studies, or the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation Georg Foster Award. So I'm very glad that you're here, Selcuk, and we look forward to hearing your talk.
It's an honor and a pleasure to be part of this project. And the first day was very exciting, with all, new ideas and debates emerging on the concept of the Academy of Planetary Humanities. My presentation is going to be a very modest, commentary, if I may, because I feel as if, this is still in the making. In other words, it's a concept around which everyone is contributing, and it still is in the process of thinking and, debating about, what should be the Academy of Planetary Humanities, if it's going to be defined as such. These are ideas that come to my mind because we've gone through and we're still going through, it's not finished yet, a very, world-changing process, and it came from nature, the COVID-19 pandemic, but there was also human hubris and the involvement in the extension of this, viral epidemic around the world with such lethal consequences. So we're, I think, at a stage where we're looking now back at the decades of globalization and maybe sort of coming to terms with the end of the euphoria. And the euphoria wasn't just, please don't tell me it was just global capital. Intellectuals were part of it too. And running around the world and enjoying it, meeting people, great. Exchanging ideas, forming new contacts, seeing new places. It was really a sort of rolling, kind of like the rolling 20s, but rolling late 20th century. So that euphoria and that sort of excitement of, oh my God, isn't it great? We can go beyond the the national borders. We can enjoy the transnational. We can be world citizens with airplane tickets to prove it, running around the world, I mean, I think that we were all part of that sort of maybe self-centered, if I may say so, celebration of what technology can give us. Because compared to the pre-digital age, and of course, the technology of transportation and communication that resulted, it's all actually the commercialization of technologies that the military has had, for practically half a century. So they finally allowed some of it to be commercialized. I mean, let's also be realistic about, the history of technology. It comes from, usually space and military research. And then at some point, it's allowed to be, commercialized, some of it, when it's kind of a little bit outdated, I realized this when I actually encountered, through someone who was working during the Second World War as part of the war effort in the United States, forming intelligence know-how against imperialist Japan. And in his library, he had a copy. It was a fantastic copy of, let's put it this way, 4 or 5 dictionaries, all binded together, but it wasn't real print, And he said, well, it's a photocopy, he said, the Xerox. And I said, wow, 1940s? He said that was military secret technology. They allowed the global economy to use it only as late as 1970s, if you should remember. So back in Harvard University, they were photocopying stuff really fast to catch up with what the Japanese were doing, and they needed dictionaries to be photocopied, quickly. There wasn't enough time to print it out, in the press and stuff. So we are living this age, and I suppose, given our checkered, experience with the digital age in the last, 30 years, I should say, we have to, I suppose, now be at a position where we can be selective, choose good uses of the digital capacity of, communicating with all of you, with maybe more people all around the world in an unprecedented manner. I don't want to harbor the point about the lethal and very disturbing effects of the, COVID-19 virus in, pandemic. You all know it, and we've lived through it, and we're still living through it. But one little maybe positive result was that we've desperately realized the importance of communicating, of keeping up contacts, human contacts, having conversations, when you have the specter of death looming above you, you suddenly come to terms with what's important and what's not important. You make a selection very quickly. And communicating with one's, academic friends, I call them, or intellectual friends. I don't like the term simply intellectual, It's just a little bit too it seems to me self-centered, but intellectual friends or intellectual counterparts that we've been able to communicate with them, keep up the work. Imagine if we didn't have this simple technology that has been, inherited from the business community and before that from the military space community. How could we talk to each other? It would have been impossible. We were all incarcerated in our houses. So how can this technology be used to continue planetary communication is a great challenge. I've just looked at the non-academic. I think there was a comment yesterday about why don't we go a little less academic, I don't know, was it Walter? Somebody said this, mentioned it. I was just listening to the presentation of Rahaf Harfoush, who was the media leg of Obama's campaign, where the use of the digital communication network did contribute for the first time significantly to a presidential election, and it was Obama's election. And right now she's still a young woman, very active in New York. I believe she's originally from Canada, and the director of the Red Thread Institute of Digital Culture. Now, mind you, she's absolutely enthusiast. She's a businesswoman, working for the business world, if you will. So she's an absolute enthusiast, and she thinks that, the digital revolution can be used to enhance creativity and replace the constricting work models of the older mass production line-based office culture of the Industrial Revolution. So it can be used in a new way to enhance creativity, whereas she thinks that old culture of you go to the office, and you make work lists and busy, you have to do this, you have to do that, and so on. She finds that was actually very constricting of, creativity, whereas she thinks now with the use of the digital world's offering of interface, that it will be possible to, in fact, enhance creativity. Now, I'm neither for or against or anything. I'm just sort of passing on this information. Rahaf Harfoush, who is sort of right in the midst of how the digital, is part of and was part of political campaigning, in the United States, and it continued to be as such during the later campaigns of Trump and probably Biden and so on and so forth. Politics now is being conducted on a very techno, it's disturbing sometimes, but on a techno level. So we don't know what's going to be the outcome of the digital revolution, but it has made connectivity on such a large scale possible. It would have been unimaginable in our youth, at least in my youth, that we need to come to terms with it and maybe make good use of it, the best use of it. We can be selective, surely. And we can make good use of technology. That's always a classic, challenge. That was the challenge when electricity was invented. It was the challenge when, the automobile was, or the steam engine. It's a question of how you use technology and for what purposes. You can't stop it. You can't avoid it. You can't ignore it completely. Now, so this, I'm borrowing from yesterday. I believe it was Dibesh Chakrabarty's comment, the global ecumeny of humanists. Who are the humanists? If we take the Renaissance definition, humanism is very specific. It's historic. It means people who are dealing with the secular topics of human activity. Tends to always include artists, people of literature, of language, potentially history, philosophy. But today, humanists, maybe humanist is a larger concept. I mean, we're not living in the 15th century, and we're not, all of us are not, Renaissance Italians at all. So maybe humanists and humanism, you know, the first challenge is to fill that concept. It doesn't have to be exactly the same as what it was in the 15th century or how it is in the departments of humanities, which in themselves have become classic institutions, sometimes quite inflexible. I remember I was an admirer of Edward Said because I was a young graduate student when he was a dashing young professor of English literature in Columbia University. We all attended his lectures in awe and admiration, as you would expect, I suppose. So I had a kind of personal friendship with him, and late in his life, and he gave um, lectures on this, a series of lectures on this at Columbia. He was critical of the fact that in the Columbia program of the humanities, which goes with the rubric of contemporary civilizations, each group, it's multicultural when you look at it from the outside. You've got Asian civilization, Western civilization, Indian civilization, Chinese civilization. That's all very fine, but they're all separate from each other, you see. So you get Muslim scholarship in the line for Islamic civilization, Indian scholarship in the line for Indian civilization, but they never meet. The student is expected to take at least two, one Western, one non-Western line of civilization. Well, that's good. That's better than being Euro-American based or something, but they don't touch each other. They're sort of like fish swimming in the sea, but they don't touch each other, They sort of swim past each other. So he was complaining about that, and he felt that somehow the great savants or the great thinkers of the humanities, in the classic sense, should be taught together in conversation with each other, even if they never had a chance to meet each other, obviously, because they were geographically living in different places, different times, and speaking different languages. Let's not forget that. So to fill the concept of the humanities and the humanists, I think that it might be a good idea to have a session, talking about this exactly. Whom do we mean? And what do we mean by the humanities? A second idea that comes to my mind is, I find it, well, maybe it's because of my age, I've been through a lot. Yeah, sure. My second point, and I'm going to stop there, is sometimes it's a little too restricted to have humanities people talk to themselves. In the end of the day, we're all products of very similar formation, although this group here maybe is a kind of very, I think, creative combination of scholars in the larger sense of the humanities, dealing with social science, with history, and so on. But sometimes, shall we say, let's stretch the definition, humanities to social sciences, or human sciences, we tend to repeat as well, just repeat familiar concepts. Maybe this community should also include natural scientists, form a systematic dialogue with people who are in the hardcore sciences, and have conversations with their conceptualization. Maybe we will not be able to understand all the details of their research. I mean, that requires a rigorous, different kind of training. But surely we can understand, and they can understand us when we talk at the level of ideas, of approaches, of concepts. It seems to me without the scientist conversation today, when we are moving into space, humanities people alone face the danger of repeating themselves, is my second point. And thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Selcuk, for your thought-provoking presentation. And our next speaker is Professor Ping-chen from she used to be at the Chinese University of Hong Kong as a professor of history and a dean. And she's now the Secretary General of the International Council for Philosophy and Human Sciences, SIPSH. She holds this position since 2020. She's also the SIPSH Chair in New Humanities at the University of California at Irvine, and the Director of the Taiwan Research Center of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and the founder and president of the Asian New Humanities Net. She is widely published. I mean, she's a historian with an interest in women's studies, children's health, gender and family relations, and intellectual and social history. And she also has written, published great contributions on the place of the Chinese humanities in a global context.
Good, thank you. Let's see if this share screen would work. Well, yeah, good morning and good afternoon. Thanks for creating this occasion to brainstorm about planetary humanities. To inhabit an academy concerned about the planet and owned by all has been a dream shared by many, certainly known by, let's see, this could, Sui, are you there? Could you operate? I can't get this thing to move. So, it cannot move. I tried
Should
it.
I share it with my device or?
Oh?
Yeah.
No, I don't want to use it. How to do this? But I don't know how to do this. Maybe I'll move. Roll this. Okay. All right. So it's been known by different names. This Planetary Academy. And the wise part of the idea, as stated in the announcement for this workshop, is not difficult to fathom. With the many shortcomings of the real academy that we do have, it's easy to understand why people would wish to have such an academic community with a broader boundary, or perhaps an open society in pursuit of knowledge, trailing after earlier endeavors of world history, global humanities, etc., now having the entire planet Earth in mind, operated by the planetary intellectual citizens. Okay. So the concept, for the curiosity and well-being of the good blue Earth, to be jointly investigated by fellow citizens in the ownership of everyone interested, looking at the galaxy at a distance. It's an attractive one. You see here that similar attempts have been made by SIPSH Planetary Health and Humanities. This is last year, 2020, in April, and then June, and then August online too. So in these changing times, moreover, as it had been mentioned by many, there are many reasons for wanting to bring arts and sciences together, now that we are increasingly enabled by many new technological devices never available to us before. And the pandemic has indeed made all inhabitants of this planet more keenly aware of our collective vulnerability and our common need of each other's help as one species. From arts and sciences, UNESCO UN has both International Council of Science and International Council of Philosophy and Human Sciences that I represent. We have a clearer intent now to want to make this big intellectual crossing. We're just discussing that to be facilitated creatively by current technological devices to make the best of the ongoing contemporary crisis into a bold opportunity of sorts, to turn the page together, to generate a paradigm shift actively, prospectively, not passively, unerringly, retrospectively. Namely, this is what we may choose to do, to seize the moment and act upon it positively. The how part of such an initiative had also been imagined before, whether to call them multiple hubs or observatories. These multiple workstations can serve as the actual anchoring basis for such a design, always in the plural. Added to Western Europe, North America, Asian Pacific, and Africa have been suggested to be included in this initiative. According to the UN way of mapping out the world, South America, Eastern Europe can be added as well, as could Middle East and the South and others, as many in the group come with these backgrounds, in fact, so that various partners may be engaged as individual scholars, fellow university campuses, funding agencies, friendly international organizations, as each bear conveniences that you could see that others might not. Each different categories of agents bear different strengths. SHIPS, the International Council of Philosophy and Human Sciences that I come from, could be one such organization, and we are more than willing to be part. As indeed, a good 72 years ago, when SHIPS was first dreamed of, SHIPS was this council, was meant to be this global planetary operative agency. So we may carry on indeed, aiming at achieving small goals. I just showed the European conference taking place in May in Lisbon with 450 or 500 scholars addressing these common goals, and we can bring them on board. Ships have been meant to be this global planetary operator, so that we may carry on aiming at achieving small goals gradually, one step at a time, for the accumulative effects in modest increments. And we are to discuss these what or why or hows later, for which, in the interest of time, a old poem come to mind, and this will be of some curiosity to you because it showed that sentiment had been around for a long time. This is a ode among one of the 19 ancient odes from before the Han Dynasty in China or the Common Era in world history. These intriguing lyrics that I share with you, read it out in recital in old dialects called Miles and Miles to Go, 行行重行行, for which I enclose here for your amusement. We may not have time to play that out, but the old recital remind us that you could listen to the recital later. To continue to pull resources and talents together, big and small here or there. But we need to do this over the long haul. So the lyric had it, the verses said that it will be a very long journey, that it would be better if we would eat well and sleep well to go for this long walk. Let me show you this. I'm going to play a minute or two. All right. So, now, actually, they continue to have discoveries of the connections between um, East, this Eurasian continent, over the land or by sea in the Bronze Age. Um, so I actually think that this is high time that we can reconnect and sort of carry on this long journey. This is an anonymous ode that's recorded from 2,000 years ago, sort of expressing the sentiment of wanting to connect from afar, making the big crossing, and to carry on. So the last verse said, 努力加餐饭, so people should remember to eat well and sleep well because it will be a long journey. I suppose this could be cheering us on too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ping-chen, for these deep reflections on the planetary humanities and all the institutional experience, and of course also the beautiful recital. So our next speaker is Dr. Nkatha Kabira, and she's a senior lecturer at the University of Nairobi at the School of Law, and a postdoctoral fellow at the IFE Institute of Advanced Studies in Nigeria. And she completed a doctoral degree a few years ago at Harvard Law School, and she's working on turning this into a book, tentatively titled The Law of Commissions, a case study of the place of commissions in law and governance in Kenya. And she has professional and research experience in several areas ranging from law and language to democracy and governance and to gender and the law. So welcome, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I am very excited to participate in this forum, and I've really enjoyed listening to the past 2 days. The title of my presentation today is Reimagining the Humanities, Lessons from Feminist and African Epistemologies. As we reimagine the humanities, we must consider that the future of the humanities is a product of the past. We cannot understand where we are going without knowing where we are coming from. The future of the humanities is a product of historical narratives renewed. The history of the future of the humanities is the sum parts of the past and the present. And the pandemic has forced us to think about the future of the humanities, how it is evolving, how it is being transformed by the realities of the day. The pandemic is certainly shaping the future of the humanities. Like many other parts of the world, the changing role of technology has forced the humanities to adapt to the changing times. In his famous book, Arrow of God, critically acclaimed author and novelist Chinua Achebe refers to an African proverb which goes like this. Eneke the bird says that since men have learned to shoot without missing, he has learned to fly without patching. The meaning of this African proverb is that people change depending on the circumstances. You also change to adjust yourself, and that's what societies do. That is exactly what the pandemic has forced us to reckon with. We have had to change our ways of thinking, our ways of learning, our ways of teaching, but even then, the past is still prorogue. What would it mean to reimagine the humanities? What would reimagining the humanities look like? In this presentation, I would like to make three main points. The first point is what we must reimagine what decolonizing the humanities means and what it entails. The second point is that we must reimagine what greening the humanities means and what it entails. The third point is that we must reimagine what feminizing or engendering the humanities means and what it entails. In reimagining what decolonizing, engendering, and greening might look like, several things come to mind, which I'd like to share with you, and I've grouped them into 10 key areas. The first area relates to unpacking knowledge. Although many African countries have been independent from their colonial masters for more than 50 years, nevertheless, many universities continue to rely on traditional epistemological approaches, which more often than not fail to capture the lived realities in many African socio-political contexts. And this is because the disciplines are still very much structured and informed by Eurocentric epistemologies. Mainstream knowledge production systems have focused on market-centered, economy-driven, neoliberal constructions of knowledge production, and by so doing, have left out other sources of knowledge, such as experiences as sources of knowledge, bodies as sources of knowledge, intuition as sources of knowledge. Unpacking what knowledge is and what it constitutes would entail asking questions such as, what is knowledge? What is included and what is excluded? Who are the producers and consumers of the knowledge? How is the knowledge produced? How is it packaged? How is it distributed? When was the knowledge produced and when was it distributed? Who is included in the knowledge? Who is excluded from the knowledge? How is the knowledge recorded and distributed? The second area relates to demystifying power and its impact on knowledge production. Although central assumptions of epistemology are that it is neutral and universally applicable, mainstream epistemology in its very neutrality is submerged in specific scientific interests. And as many feminists have argued, the interests of historically privileged groups of Anglo-American, European, white, middle-class, and educated male worldviews, with the assumption that the male possesses the exclusive authority to know, the male has expertise, the male exercises power to know and to apportion that what is known, and the male possesses knowledge. The question of power, what it is and what it constitutes, is an age-old question in post-colonial theory that must be revisited as we reimagine the humanities. Questions of power are crucial because existing socio-economic and political relations are kept in place by prevailing power structures. Most of the visible power has to do with decision-making and the ability to force others to do what the power holder prescribes. Essentially, power reveals itself when it is being exercised. Unpacking power, what it is and what it constitutes, would entail asking questions such as who has power? What is the source of this power? Who receives power? What is the nature of this power? How is this power exercised? How is this power maintained? How is it perpetuated? And how is it distributed? The third point involves not only humanizing narration, but womanizing narration. The question of who is telling the story, for whom, where, when, who acts, what kind of activities are they involved in, what technologies are they using, how often do they act, who initiates what sort of action, is there a hierarchy of activities, what is it like, who is at the top of the hierarchy, and why? What are the implications for those who are higher up in the hierarchy and those who are lower down in the hierarchy? These are some questions which are inspired by the ABCs of gender analysis, which was developed by Kabira and Machete in Nairobi. The seventh point is on experiential knowledge. The great adage that if you want to know about someone, ask that person. If you want to know about women, ask women. If you want to know about fisher communities in Kenya, ask those fisher communities. If you want to know about the Maasai, you ask the Maasai, ask that particular community. The first point of knowledge is contextual. Reimagined humanities must emphasize on experiential and previously undocumented knowledge. The fifth point is that of propositional knowledge. There are several ways that dominant knowledge disadvantages what the Comoros refer to as theory from the South. Propositional knowledge ensures that all human inquiry is included, and it gives them epistemic authority. The sixth point to note is the significance of the systematization of experiences in the knowledge production process. Yesterday, Walter asked such a brilliant question, and I think Professor Esenbel asked it today again. How might we make the humanities less academic? How might we reimagine less academic, reimagined communities? As Dale Spender notes, the systematization of experiences aims to capture in words the meanings, the feelings, the intuitions, which are manifested in lived experience, transformed into an object in support of knowledge in action. This means that to set the research agenda, determine, prioritize, and verify the results, and importantly, systematizing the experiences in the people's own words and in their own tongues and in their own voices, as Professor Hsiung has just brilliantly presented in that artistic representation. The seventh point is that as we reimagine the humanities, we must reclaim forgotten histories. This would entail telling, retelling, and documenting these stories. It entails recognizing, celebrating, and utilizing sources of knowledge such as digital storytelling, proverbs, songs, music, dance, poetry, which has been passed down from generation to generation. During the pandemic, I absolutely loved hearing my students express themselves through poetry, through song and storytelling, something that they would never have done in a traditional law classroom setting in the school of law. The eighth point is that as we reimagine the humanities, we must break down physical, linguistic, and disciplinary boundaries. I completely agree with the first two speakers that the arts and sciences must be reimagined as part of a collaborative whole. The physical, linguistic, and disciplinary boundaries must be overcome so as to avoid the fragmentation in the disciplines that has resulted in fragmented laws and policies that has resulted in massive challenges, massive governance challenges all over the world, but particularly in Africa. The ninth point is that we must consider Ubuntuizing the humanities. This entails collaborative knowledge generation rather than individual knowledge generation by embodying the great African philosophy, I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am. In fact, Mary Kinyanjui, in her new book titled Wanjiko in Global Development, says that if we are to think of an anti-capitalist economy, we should look for it no further than in the production and exchange that is done in Africa's informal economy. She argues that informal economy operators in African socio-political contexts exhibit self-determination, self-reliance, communal bonds, and solidarity. Their aim is to actualize self, family, and communal aspirations. The last point is that as we reimagine the humanities, it would entail humanizing technology and recognizing that technology means different things to different people world over. Keeping in mind that technology not only includes, but excludes and reorders hierarchies and hegemonies. It would entail asking questions such as, what is the nature of the technology that is being used? Does the technology require special skills? Who has these skills and why? What are the implications for those who have acquired the skills versus those who have not acquired those particular skills? As we reimagine the humanities, like Eneke, the African bird, we must learn to fly without patching. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your
Great presentation.
Stimulating remarks and your plea for a widened understanding of the humanities. Thanks a lot. So the next presenter is Professor Premesh Lalu, and he is the Professor of History and former Director of the Center for Humanities Research at the University of Western Cape in South Africa. He has published widely in academic journals such as History and Theory, Journal of Southern African Studies, and Africa Focus. And his first book was titled The Deaths of Hintsa, Post-Apartheid South Africa and the Shape of Recurring Pasts. And this is just an example of several books and writings. Premesh, when looking at you, it reminds us that it's now winter in South Africa, right? I see you wearing a scarf, but now you already have your presentation up. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me. It is very cold in Cape Town, so I'm going to try my best to be as precise and stick to the time. I just want to preface before I start. I thought I'd respond to the challenge of the organizers by thinking about the question in relation to a book that I'm currently working on called The Techne of Trickery, The Myth of Race and the Undoing of Apartheid. And so I'm trying to work through several themes in this book that I hope will respond to the bigger question of the concept of the planetary and what I'm calling a planetary sensibility. I'm going to read my comments so that I can hold to the time limits that have been placed on the presentations. Francis Danby's The Opening of the Sixth Seal at the Irish National Gallery was completed in 1828 on the cusp of an emerging planetary sensibility at the end of slavery and the beginning of a revolution in science and technology in the 1830s. I wonder if we can just call up that image. With apocalyptic overtones, Danby depicts an unshackled slave, arms outstretched to the opening heavens as a lightning bolt breaches the growing chasm between heaven and earth. The placement of the figure of the emancipated slave, slightly ahead of the kneeling slave, calls for a reading of the painting that is not limited to the apocalyptic, but also encompasses the prophetic. The lightning bolt running through the opening contemplates the interplay of altered relations between nature and history, and the onset of a new phase of the co-evolution of human and technology. Danby's painting presents us with a question: who precisely is the subject of a planetary humanities? On closer examination, one notices a stitch running through the canvas, evidence of the mutilation of the painting by a disgruntled viewer who cut out the figure of the emancipated slave while the work was on display in an industrial town in Britain in 1843. The effort to suture the slave back into the image demands to be read for what it reveals about the uncanny returns of race in the co-evolution of human and technology, and that the painting thematizes. Succinctly put, what Danby's painting provides is a premonition of what the future held out for the subject of race in the wake of slave emancipation, and the intimation of a catastrophic planetary sensibility tied to a scientific and technological revolution at the end of slavery. Today, Danby's premonition is playing out on a site at the foot of Table Mountain in Cape Town, on a sacred ground where the first victory over the Portuguese was fought by the original Khoisan inhabitants in 1510, and which was later settled by force during the Dutch colonial period by French Huguenots. Can we move 2 slides ahead, please? Here on the edges of the Cape Colony, one more, yeah. Here on the edges of the Cape Colony, echoes of anguished cries of slaves having their backs broken on the banks of the Lispik River can be heard in the archive of atrocity. Here, Amazon.com is currently orchestrating a multi-billion rand plan to house their South African operations. In the past year, representatives of environmental, civic, and indigenous formations have targeted the tech giant for the insistence on building on this historical site of colonial conquest. Caught between the sacred and the profane, between indigeneity and technopoly, the land along the Lispik River attests to a repressed secret, one that haunts a necessary reimagining of the planetary. It tells the story of how the interests of speculative capitalism and empire marshaled the free-floating signifier of race towards a catastrophic planetary sensibility in the wake of slavery in 1834. Beyond the dread of wars of conquest against indigenous pastoralists, not far from where a defeated Zulu monarch was kept prisoner following the wars with British Empire, and where slaves were tortured and executed, the site where Amazon today proposes a new tech venture was once where the astronomer John Herschel mounted his telescope to map the constellations of the southern skies. Arriving at the Cape in 1834, Herschel undertook his explorations in the midst of the unfolding abolition of slavery and a scientific revolution which he had helped to spark. John Herschel and his contemporaries initiated the revolution in scientific method while at Cambridge University that was later firmly entrenched in the scripts of empire. The new scientific method was a product of institutionalization and orientation towards a nascent public sphere. It departed from earlier preoccupations with recording scientific error to a more affirmative, confident stance in relation to in the relationship between state and the public sphere. Much of this affirmative rendering of science was elaborated in Herschel's seminal 1831 book, A Preliminary Discourse on the Study of Natural Philosophy. Herschel oriented scientific research towards the future, introducing the word photography and inspiring the likes of Charles Darwin, who proclaimed him as the greatest living philosopher of his time. However, as science drifted towards the heavens, the signifying knot that formed around race at the end of slavery inadvertently bound the episteme of the planetary sciences to the project of empire, despite the often secular anti-colonial claims of a newly formed guild of scientists. The new science, emboldened by exploratory impulses, can we just move to the next slide? This is Herschel's book, and this is the person I'm referring to, arrived at the Cape in 1834. The new science, emboldened by the exploratory impulse of empire and astronomy, turned its back on the slave and opted to allow for the mythic to gather ground, rather than making the slave the very condition for the relationship of science to state and the public sphere. Thus, instead of signaling the dawn of a spirit of freedom, the figure of the slave merely became a warning about the slide into a more mechanized form of life. The wound of race in slavery would fester in the space opened by a co-evolution of the human and technology over a period of 200 years. In the wake of slavery, a racial technogenesis redirected a planetary sensibility towards the ends of speculative capitalism and empire. Ideas of freedom built on slave emancipation were surrendered to the interests of a mythic liberal utopianism where race accrued in the co-evolution of the human and technology. Race accumulated, it accrued, it accreted, and was ultimately repressed and reclaimed, bringing a planetary sensibility that was possible with the end of slavery to the brink of a planetary catastrophe in our modernity. If the scale, we can move on to the next slide. If the scale of a planetary sensibility refers to the point at which the planetary sciences succumb to a catastrophic futurity, how might we hold on to a concept of the planetary humanities that fulfills the promise of freedom in modernity? This question confronted Silas Molema, a young South African medical student based in Glasgow, who set out to reflect on the past and future of race in the midst of the uncertainties of the First World War. Reflecting on the seeming contradiction of scientific progress and the entrapments of humanity in the discourse of race, Molema turned to the poetry of Roy Campbell to sum up the growing anxiety of the scientists in 1920. O star-eyed science, hast thou wandered there to waft us home a message of despair? It is hard to miss the sense of bewilderment reflected in these lines. Perhaps in it we will discover the disappointment about how the planetary sciences failed in its purpose to enchant the terrestrial sphere of the global. Molema seems at odds with the desubjectification underway in the star-eyed science of his day, at a time when the subject of race was being offered little prospect of futurity. With the encroaching threat of race war, the generation of intellectuals of the Black Atlantic set out to undo the constitutive epistemic knot of race. Molema's generation sought an iteration of a planetary sensibility that freed the subject from the perpetuity of race in the discourse of the global. Molema's haunting citation of an excerpt from the poem by Roy Campbell reflects on the themes of race, science, and despair contained in this poem, underlines how the quest for freedom in the wake of slavery encountered its limit in the slide of the human into more mechanized forms of life. Along with the figure of the slave, race became a sign of the becoming technical of the human. What Molema recalled in 1920 was a configuration that dated back to the 1830s. As he came to realize, this was a subject not of a new geopolitics defined by capitalism, but of a futurity gambled on the speculation of a planetary sensibility. Returning, can you move to the next slide, please? Returning to the contested site where Amazon plans to expand its empire, I am reminded how in the wake of apartheid, we are yet again living through a phase of this co-evolution where the chasm between freedom and the mythic ends of race has grown wider. Might a new configuration of a planetary sensibility rescue us from the circular causality of the eternal and uncanny returns of race? This question has occurred to me as I think about the work of deconstituting race in William Kentridge and Handspring Puppet Company's production of Faustus in Africa, performed in the 1990s. Mostly, I've been interested in how the plot of Goethe's final installation of the Faust legend in the 1830s thickens when its endpoints are threaded through the ruins of empire in Africa. I've been intrigued by the way in which it opens up questions, as Nkatha has said, between genocide and femicide. The receding horizon of futurity is a recurring motif in theatrical works such as Goethe's Faustus II and Buchner's Wojciech, also conceived in the 1830s. At least in one register, the rise of an intellectual milieu of 1834, the emergence of the traditions of Weltliteratur and Natur philosophy, and their respective recuperation of the traditions of classicism points to efforts to thwart the slide into more mechanized forms of life. When we gather how the mythic speculations underpinning a Euro-American episteme gave to Africa an unlivable futurity of race, it becomes possible to grasp why Amazon should build its technopoly on the site where the catastrophe of the planetary sensibility once took hold. Against this failed planetarity, We might take a leaf from the gift that Seamus Heaney delivered to Mandela in the form of the Cure at Troy, where the subject is not the all too familiar hero Odysseus, but rather the lesser known Philoctetes, a wounded archer torn between the conceit of freedom and the half-true rhyme of deceit. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Premesh Lalu, for your thought-provoking presentations that touches upon some really crucial issues and questions that we face when thinking about planetary humanities. And our next speaker, Professor Wang of Tsinghua University, he cannot be here right now, but we just made sure to pre-record his presentation, and we're going to play it now. Yeah, our next presenter is Professor Wang from Tsinghua University, and we are very honored to have his statement here today. Professor Wang is a very renowned scholar in the field of Chinese history and also literary studies. But beyond these fields, he also has made very interesting and significant contributions regarding to various questions facing China's past, present, and future, and its global context. Unfortunately, Professor Wang has a very important meeting at his university today, so we had to pre-record this little statement, but we are very glad to hear his short comments on the questions of planetary humanities. Professor Wang.
Thank you very much, Dominic. It's pity that I cannot join you in person, and also, but thanks to the technology, we still can do something here. And I just give some few words for the comments on the issue of humanities in China. Here, the first one, let me list some basic conditions for the establishment of the humanities. Because when we use the humanities, a lot of scholars will trace back to the very early days, like ancient time, Confucius time, even earlier, and they try to compare that long tradition with Greek tradition or other great Asian tradition. But the humanist knowledge and the humanities as a subject or discipline is different things, I think, because basically humanities as a discipline was only established in China in the 20th century. It's not it's different early knowledge. So the first condition for the establishment of the modern humanities in China, I think it's formed as it's not Confucian classics, lost its sacredness and hegemony. Generally speaking, its values are to some extent post-classical. It can compare to the European, maybe in some sense, the post-theological is a post-classical, namely the vernacular values of man, though because I reluctant to use the term of secular, because the religious as secular as a binary was somehow framed the whole arguments for these kind of humanist knowledge. So basically it's a post-Confucian classical term when we talk about humanities in China. So that's the means that established only in the 20th century. But on the other hand, there was a long tradition, humanist cultural tradition in a very long way, 1,000 years. I will talk it later. Second, the modern Chinese humanities generated in the so-called the clash between the East and the West, and in the formation of nation state in 19th and 20th century. Its disciplines were set up under the influence of the European and American universities and in connection with the self-narrative of nation state. So the whole China had a long tradition of different knowledge. So we know that in the Zhou dynasty, you have the Liu Yi, 6 arts, where that's very different taxonomy. And also after the Han Dynasty, you have the Qiyue, another kind of the taxonomy. But afterwards, most influential taxonomy were so-called classics, philosophers, collection, and history. So this is Jing, Shi, Zi, Ji. That's the four taxonomy. The four branches of taxonomy was dominated for quite a long times, especially after the Sui Dynasty. Ming and the Qing was absolutely dominant. So in each branch of the four parts of the knowledge, for example, in classics, the poetry was also the classics. And history, it could be thought as different kind of the genres were embedded in different sides, which means that now the formal disciplines, now the modern disciplines in humanities is very different from old taxonomies. So that's a very different stories. And the modern disciplines was installed into the university system in the early 20th century. So that's after the collapse of the National Examination Service, the National Service Examination System. So when the new university system is established, so that's the other new idea. Third condition, I think, is a modern Chinese humanities was born in a competition with sciences for the hegemony, influenced by modern scientific methodology, and at the same time attempting to prove its autonomous position that differs from science and its methodology. Mm. So basically, the new knowledge in the late 19th century to the early 20th century started from the translation or the importation from the European knowledge, mainly technology and the natural science. So here, only after the war, especially during the World War I, a lot of the scholars had a reflection on the science and the technology domination. So that's why they argue for the independence of the human knowledge, which differed methodologically from the scientific methodology. Basically, this is the arguments for. That's why gradually the humanities became more autonomous disciplines, which means that are different from the traditional, different from the science and the technology. So that's because in the late Qing period, a lot of people introduced the concepts or the conception or the concept of science, not only in the sense of the technology, but also at the new morals. Like, for example, we know that the slogans, science and democracy in the May 4th New Cultural Movement, means that the science is not only for the natural science or the technology, the science is ethical and moral issues too, and the political values too. So in that sense, now, but after the World War I, in the wave of the reflection on the crisis, so-called civilizational crisis, the people argue for the independence and autonomy of the humanities, which means that keep the distance from the scientific worldview or the scientific methodology and the disciplines. So this is the third condition. And the fourth, I think, is also important. On the one hand, now we are living in the universities, or like a Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Now, in each scholars working in their own field, quite professionalized in a very specific field. However, the modern humanities actually emerged, especially in the later Qing and the May 4th period, after the 1980s and 90s. It's really the modern humanities and the intelligentsia and the cultural movements interact intimately with each other. Specialized academic research and the movements of thought and culture inspired and buttress each other. the reform in the Beijing University under the Tsai Ing-pei's leadership during the May 4th period were deeply influenced by the new cultural movements. You have the cultural movements interacted with the new formation of the disciplines in these fields. So, and in the 1980s, a lot of the cultural movements here and the introduction series and a translation book series and a different kind of is what we call the so-called the New Enlightenment, had an interaction between the developments of humanities and the social sciences and the culture and movements. In the 1990s, for example, I was the editor-in-chief of Doshu magazine. We launched a series of the debates. Some were in the very specific fields, like the archaeology or some culture, geology, and so on and so forth. But these kind of the debates is not only for the special scholars, but also for the general cultural debates, and they eventually had a huge impact on the development and generated new ideas in the humanities. So that's, I think, the basic conditions. Now, let me try to even follow this logic. We can see what's the challenges now in contemporary situation. I think it's the first, that confronted with the globalization now and the regionalization, or new cultural, the nationalist movement, for example, the substance and the division of humanities will need to readjust now. Hence, the following questions: how to evaluate disciplinary division of contemporary humanities? How could we take the relationship of the disciplines of humanities with different traditions of humanities into account? As I said, that from late 19th century, early 20th century, basically the humanity division, the disciplines of humanities shaped by so-called East and West civilization debates. So here, in history, literature, and philosophy, we have the Western philosophy, Chinese literature, or the Western literature, or the something, of course, there was a cover spread over to other places, but basically, the dominant the knowledge was Western knowledge or national knowledge. So inside of that minority, if that term still can be used, the cultures inside of one country or in the global sphere, the different cultures in different traditions, Latin America, Africa, or Asian countries, how that kind of knowledge can be reorganized into the disciplines of humanities. It's a big issue now. It's still the big issue. This is the one challenge. Second, economic globalization has not led to absolute disenchantment of world. On the contrary, as a secular life prospered, religion and diverse traditions also seem to revive. Here in China, where obviously there was a revival of the classical studies, in Chinese is the Jingxue. It's not in the field of philosophy, but really the classical studies, which also means that the purpose of the scholarship on the classics differed from the early studies on the classics in the post-May 4th period. The post-May 4th classical studies mean that use or apply the scientific methodology to reintroduce all the proof readings and so on and so forth, the classics. But now they try to revival the scholarship on the meaning, value of the classics, which means that the traditional values, and also in other countries, some other countries, well, some certain kind of the religious knowledge re-emerged. How should we redefine the mission of humanities in this context is a real issue, because it's it's really a huge challenge to the traditional formation of the humanities. Third, I think the position of contemporary humanities, as I said, came into being in its connection as well as a separation from the natural sciences. In Chinese, we know that in ancient time, the 人文, the human or the humanities, is 关乎人文 in Chinese. You observed the human, the law of human development. And also another term, it's managed or cultivated the whole world of the. These are the following for the Book of Change. Another was 观乎天文, observed the sky or the heaven, and it means that you need to know the whole order of the natural order. But in any case, the human and the natural order was bound together, not separated at all. So but in the early period, even in the taxonomy of science, there was no clear separation between the humanities and the science. The basically new taxonomy was a scientific taxonomy. Only in a very specific condition, that separation or the arguments for the autonomy and the independence of humanities was emerged in a post-World War I context for the reflection. But as the development of artificial intelligence, genetic technology, ecological science, and all these new developments is impacting the way of human lives. Given the current situation of the disciplinary demarcation, how could we redefine the relationship between the humanities and the natural sciences? When, early days, we argue for the autonomy of humanities. That's very important for the reflection. But on the other hand, since the humanities are so specialized, made for several generations, scholars in the fields had no capacity to understand the new developments of the natural sciences. So it's a strengthen the value of humanities or the weaken the strength of humanities became a big question. So how could the humanities draw the strength from the developments of the natural sciences while remain capable of reflecting critically on such developments has become the crucial issue now. Because they can now, the people, of course, still a lot of the humanist scholars publish the critical reflections on the new developments of the new technology and the spreading over for different things. But on the other hand, we can see immediately that the general societies can ignore sometimes what your arguments for that, because you cannot get into the new developments of that. So these are the issue, rethink about the relationship between the humanities and the science in the current situation. The fourth, I think that related to these, like digital technology has significantly changed the field and the borders of humanities research. Translingual, transregional, transcultural research has stepped into a new era as a result. How shall we evaluate humanities in this digital era? So these are the big issues. Some way we can benefit from that, but what's the consequence and the sequence of that? We still need to understand. And the last challenge that I try to argue that as the academic disciplines are highly specialized now, how can humanities and education in humanities become the origin of new thinking? How to reform the intelligentsia in a world of specialization and marketization and so on and so forth. As we said that in the whole 20th century, you have different waves of the debates of the thoughts, which stimulated the developments of the humanist and the social scientific developments. New ideas came from them. But now of course, in the media, social media, you have the very short interactions. but no such deep discussion, intellectual discussion. And so it seemed that on the one hand, all the journals, magazines, and the disciplines specialized. Now, even for the younger generations, the students, they had no interest in those more socialized or the general discussions. So the interaction between the cultural moments and the developments of humanities seems disappeared. So where is the knowledge to energize the new developments for us is a new challenge. So it is because we are facing a general crisis in the world. In a pandemic, it's not only a pandemic, it's a complex of the crisis, a different kind of the series of crises together. We really need a kind of the interaction, trans-border, trans-cultural, transdisciplinary debate and a discussion together for the further development of our humanities. So, but on the other hand, we seem that had no such capacity now. We need to re-energize ourselves as a humanist scholars to do this. So thank you very much. I stop here.
Thank you very much, Wang, for these very deep and reflections and your thoughtful comments. And we look forward to talking about them in more detail. Yeah, I think now our second panel, the public part has already come to a conclusion. So I want to take this opportunity to thank everybody, all the panelists of the first and the first panel and the second panel, the chairs, our supporters, everyone for their wonderful contributions. And I think we just had like a very deep and multifaceted exchange, and it is quite clear that at least it makes me hungry for more. And I think that it's quite clear that we ought to continue this conversation in one form or another. We'll continue with our online conversations, but also hopefully an offline meeting in real physical presence will also be possible someday. So we will end now like the public part. All the panelists should stay just in the Zoom room, but we'll end now the live streaming on Zoom. And I also want to thank the